To understand why the United States is once again forging military ties with Pakistan in 2025, we have to begin by looking beyond the headlines and into the deeper layers of strategic decision making. On the surface, it may seem contradictory, even troubling, for America to be rearming a country that for years has maintained a complicated and often adversarial role in global security. Questions are swirling. Why now? Why Pakistan? And what does this say not only about U.S. policy, but about America's sense of identity as a global leader? The uncomfortable answer is this: America's foreign policy has entered another transactional phase. It's less about values and more about leverage, less about who shares our convictions and more about who serves our current interests. And if there is any betrayal in rearming Pakistan, it's not just a betrayal against an ally like India. It may ultimately be a betrayal of America's own moral clarity, but from the lens of Washington, the decision is rational, even predictable. The rearming of Pakistan in 2025 is being framed as part of a broader strategy to counterbalance China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. With China encroaching economically and militarily across Asia, the U.S. is seeking to build flexible partnerships with countries that can help act as regional stabilizers, or at the very least, buffers. Pakistan, with its significant military infrastructure, geographic proximity to Afghanistan and Iran, and historically close ties to Beijing, is now being viewed as a strategic lever that can be pulled to complicate China's regional aims. In theory, it makes sense. A Pakistan more dependent on U.S. military aid is a Pakistan that may be nudged or pressured toward distancing itself from unchecked Chinese dominance. After all, Pakistan owes much of its recent infrastructure overhaul to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but with mounting debt and hemming influence, America sees an opportunity, offer security and arms, and sway Islamabad back toward the Western sphere of alignment. It's chess, not checkers, and military aid is the new currency. Yet, even smart chess moves can sacrifice pieces worth protecting. Begin to look closer at what's being traded, and the cracks in the narrative quickly appear. The U.S. is sending surveillance drones, fighter maintenance programs, special forces training, and even advanced ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance tools to a nation that has not convincingly shed its reputation as a haven for extremists, nor fully confronted its double game with terror-related groups operating inside and beyond its borders. This is not just strategy, it's a gamble, and it assumes that Pakistan will not use this revitalized military capacity in ways that run counter to U.S. interests, or worse, against its democratic neighbors, and that's where the tension gets heavy. India, America's most natural ally in the region, a democracy, a tech titan, and a vocal advocate of rule-based international order, sees this shift as a betrayal. For years, India has opened doors to Washington, signed defense and trade accords, participated in military exchanges, and stood side by side with American leadership in countering terrorism and pushing back against authoritarianism. But now, watching arms once removed from Pakistan reappear, Indian policymakers and citizens alike are asking, has our partnership been taken for granted? Have our warnings been ignored? There's a growing feeling in New Delhi that America is returning to old habits, choosing momentary leverage over long-term reliability, and when India perceives that reliability faltering, it too begins to look elsewhere for strategic friends, perhaps with stronger economic independence, perhaps even uneasily toward Russia or others, willing to offer consistency where Washington wavers. So the rearming of Pakistan may appear efficient in the short term, but it risks instability in a much broader and more important alliance. And then we must ask the deeper question, the one shaped not by politics, but by principle. Is it right? Is it wise? Are we choosing partners based solely on utility, or are we still measuring our actions against ideals? At the height of the Cold War, the United States often partnered with questionable regimes for the sake of geopolitical containment. We know how that turned out in some cases, with military assistance morphing into oppression, with weapons once sent to combat a common enemy now pointed inward at civilians or across borders at former allies. Those lessons, stained with too much blood, are not faint historical echoes, they are patterns, and patterns once ignored repeat. A.W. Tozer, though not a foreign policy expert, deeply understood the nature of compromise. He warned that when the church or a society becomes consumed with pragmatic decisions divorced from spiritual wisdom, it always loses its way, even when the path appears necessary. In the realm of global influence, the same rings true. Strategy without conscience becomes betrayal dressed in the language of national interest. So when we talk about America's decision to rearm Pakistan, we're not just debating foreign policy. We're witnessing the priorities of a nation that says one thing about peace and democracy, but does another when pressure mounts. And in that space between words and actions, something holy is lost. One cannot talk about America's decision to rearm Pakistan in 2025 without acknowledging the elephant in the room, India. For over a decade, the relationship between Washington and New Delhi has been heralded as one of the most promising partnerships of the 21st century, two of the world's largest democracies standing together for peace, prosperity, and a rules-based global order. So when the United States chooses to shift gears and send military support to Pakistan, a country India sees not merely as a rival, but as a direct and persistent threat. It's more than a strategic twist. It's a rupture, a question mark, a potential undoing of trust that has taken years to build. For India, this move feels like betrayal. Not because nations aren't allowed to change course. Foreign policy is always evolving, but because this course change ignores what India has consistently represented: a stable democracy, a strong economic ally, and a natural bulwark against both Islamic extremism and Chinese expansionism. When the U.S. begins supplying drones, training, and advanced surveillance systems to a state that has repeatedly supported militant groups operating in Indian territory, it's not just viewed as geopolitics. It's deeply personal. It reopens wounds Kargil, Mumbai, Pulwama. It tells India that the pain of those attacks and the long years spent trying to move toward peace may now be discounted in the name of American strategic recalibration. India has not stayed silent on the issue. Officials in New Delhi have expressed disappointment, voicing serious concerns over the consequences of emboldening a military establishment in Islamabad that has remained largely unaccountable for its dealings with extremist groups. But more than words, there's been a noticeable cooling in bilateral enthusiasm. Trade talks have stalled. Military exercises have been delayed. Even public appearances between the two nations' leaders have thinned out dramatically. And it doesn't take a historian to see the consequences that can follow when trust between democratic allies begins to erode. What makes this all the more tragic is that this isn't just about India feeling snubbed. This is about the broader global shift that's taking place. In an age where democratic unity is needed more than ever, against authoritarian regimes, against online disinformation, against state-sponsored cyber attacks, two of the most powerful democracies in the world are suddenly finding themselves on opposing pages. That's not just regrettable. That's dangerous. Because when countries like India begin to question whether American support is anchored in values or simply in moves on a larger geopolitical chessboard, they begin to hedge. And that hedging leads elsewhere to new alliances that might not always align with American interests or values. We're already seeing shadows of this. India, once eager to embrace Western defense systems, is continuing its strategic flirtation with Russia, balancing old military dependencies with new distrust. Even subtle gestures like deeper trade arrangements with Iran or participation in China-led economic forums suggest that India is preparing for a world where American reliability can no longer be taken for granted. And who could blame them? If your closest so-called ally is simultaneously empowering your most hostile neighbor, what exactly are you supposed to trust? Of course, Washington would argue that this isn't about picking sides, that it's about managing influence, avoiding regional collapse, and maintaining a counterweight to China. But from India's perspective, it looks a lot like the U.S. is trying to have it both ways, wooing one partner while arming another, preaching deterrence while enabling provocation. That kind of double dealing doesn't sit well in a region already saturated with history, conflict, and trauma. It sends a loud message: partnerships are conditional, alliances are negotiable, and strategic necessity will always trump moral clarity. Moreover, this perceived betrayal doesn't happen in a vacuum. It travels fast across news cycles, social media feeds, and the dense ecosystem of global diplomacy. Other nations watch how America treats its allies. They take note of who gets protected and who gets ignored. If India, with its rising economic power and cultural reach, is subject to transactional oversight, what does that say to smaller, less powerful U.S. partners around the world? The message is clear if unspoken. Stand close when we need you. Step aside when we don't. And so, while Washington may cite reasons of realpolitik and regional balance, what it may lose in the process is far more costly than any advantage gained in the moment. It risks undermining its own narrative as a trustworthy global leader. It risks pushing one of the world's most important emerging powers to find other anchors, and it risks, most dangerously, decentering its own identity, not just as a superpower, but as a principled one. Sometimes in diplomacy, as in life, how you treat your friends speaks louder than how you handle your adversaries, and the world is listening. As we consider the United States' decision to rearm Pakistan in 2025, there's a question we cannot overlook, one that cuts deeper than political or strategic analysis. It's the question of morality. At what point does security, cooperation cross the line into complicity? At what point does the pursuit of strategic advantage begin to erode the very values America claims to stand for? In re-engaging militarily with Pakistan, we're not just strengthening a regional actor with complex diplomatic value. We're equipping a state that has consistently faced credible allegations of nurturing terrorism, oppressing minorities, and undermining democratic norms within its own borders. And somehow we're telling ourselves it's worth it. Over the years, Pakistan has become known as a nation caught between its public desire for global legitimacy and its shadowy entanglement with radical elements. The facts are well documented. Osama bin Laden was found hiding in Abbottabad, just a stone's throw from Pakistan's premier military academy. For decades, the Inter-Services Intelligence ISI has operated with dual loyalties, cooperating at times with the West, while discreetly supporting jihadist factions useful for influence in Afghanistan and Kashmir. These aren't fringe accusations from rivals. These are concerns detailed in congressional reports, UN resolutions, leaked intelligence memos, and testimonies from international diplomats. And now, somehow, the U.S., the very country whose soldiers died as a result of these policies, is choosing once again to hand over weapons, training, and advanced surveillance technology. This is not just geopolitics. It's a moral test. Because here's the truth. Military aid is never neutral. It is an endorsement whether we admit it or not. When the United States signs a check, delivers drones, or deploys military trainers, it sends two messages. The first, to the recipient, we trust you, or at least we need you. And the second, to the watching world, we're willing to overlook some things, some very big things, for the sake of influence. That second message carries more weight than we like to admit. Human rights organizations have raised alarm repeatedly about the systemic persecution of religious minorities in Pakistan. Christians, Hindus, Shia Muslims, and members of the Ahmadi. Your community live in constant fear, under blasphemy laws that are among the most draconian in the world. Children are abducted, churches are burned, lives are falsely destroyed under accusations that carry mandatory death sentences. And yet, despite annual reports from watchdogs and repeated recommendations for sanctions or pressure, these realities continue. Now, with renewed military cooperation, the concern is this: how can a nation so deeply linked with religious freedom in its own self, understanding, look the other way when its partner imprisons, tortures, and silences its own people? And the implications go even further. By providing advanced weaponry and surveillance capabilities to Pakistan, we potentially deepen the state's ability to surveil and suppress dissent, to maintain undemocratic control, and to continue military operations in ways contrary to international law. Think of what these tools will be used for. Ask yourself whether American tax dollars, American developed technology, and American strategic favor should ever empower regimes with a dismal track record in justice and transparency. To ignore this is to normalize complicity. It's to pretend that aid comes with no strings, or that the consequences of our partnerships aren't ours to carry. But history says otherwise. Time and again, we've seen how arms given in pursuit of influence end up being turned toward destruction. From Latin America to the Middle East, the trail of unintended consequences bears witness. It's never just about who we arm. It's about what we silently affirm in the process. Now, some might say this is idealism, that foreign policy can't be built on moral clarity alone. But that sentiment isn't just cynical, it's short-sighted. Because when nations embrace short-term gains and neglect long-term integrity, it is always the people, especially the vulnerable ones, who suffer. And eventually, it's the credibility of the sender that breaks down. America cannot continue to claim moral authority in the world if it keeps choosing convenience over consistency. If we champion human rights when it's easy and ignore them when it's costly, we're not leaders, we're opportunists. And for those of us who follow the teachings of Christ, the stakes are even higher. A.W. Tozer once warned that a whole new generation of Christians has come up believing that it is possible to accept Christ without forsaking the world. But surely that message extends beyond individual faith to collective conscience. We cannot serve two masters in foreign policy, righteousness, and relevance. If we truly want our nation to be a force for good, we must also be willing to call out evil, even when it's dressed in strategic importance. We must advocate loudly and clearly for those whose voices have been silenced, for the imprisoned pastor, for the disappeared journalist, for the church worshiping in fear. These are not simply human tragedies, they are moral alarms. And if they do not move us, we've already begun losing our way. The rearming of Pakistan may satisfy a narrow view of national interest, but if it comes at the cost of endorsing oppression, then we haven't just abandoned our allies, we've abandoned ourselves. We stand at the crossroads of foreign policy, where strategy often triumphs over principle. We must pause and ask, how do people of conscience, especially those shaped by faith, respond? What should we think when the most powerful democracy on earth chooses to rearm a country like Pakistan, despite its troubling history with terrorism, religious persecution, and authoritarianism? Backsliding, some will tell us this is just how the world works. That foreign policy is a cold game of chess where values take a back seat to interests. But we cannot afford to reduce the world to tactics alone. Because whenever you elevate pragmatism over righteousness, you trade long-term peace for short-term gain. And that kind of deal always comes back to collect with interest. We've already walked through the strategic justifications and the implications for U.S.-India relations. We've exposed the moral cracks in backing a regime with a long shadow of injustice. But now we must go deeper, beneath the headlines and sound bites, and ask what this says about us, not just as a nation, but as a people who claim to care about justice, about truth, and about what is right. A.W. Tozer once said, "The weakness of so many modern Christians is that they feel too much at home in the world. Has that crept into our world? Have we become too comfortable with the compromises of statecraft that we no longer see the spiritual cost of silence?" The call here is not for blind idealism. This is not about pretending the world doesn't require hard choices or partnerships with flawed nations. We live in a broken world, yes, but that brokenness is not an excuse for abandoning principle. It's a reason to cling to it more fiercely. When a nation like ours decides to align itself with a regime that has not reckoned with its past or reformed its present, we are not just making practical decisions. We are shaping the moral compass of future generations. When young people ask whether values actually matter in policy, cases like this will be the answer. So what will we teach them? That power protects itself, that alliances are built only on usefulness? Or will we show them that character still matters even in diplomacy? People of faith cannot afford to look away. We cannot simply accept every new alliance as wise just because it was made by smart people in suits. Scripture tells us what happens when leaders forget righteousness. Nations rise and fall not by the strength of their armies alone, but by whether they carry out justice, protect the innocent, and steward their authority with fear of God. The prophets of old didn't just criticize the idolatry of the nations, they warned Israel, their own nation, when it aligned itself with Egypt or Assyria for protection, rather than trusting in the Lord. Why? Because doing the right thing even when it looked weak was always better than winning in the wrong way. Now, someone might ask, what does foreign policy have to do with spirituality? Why drag faith into geopolitics? But the deeper question is, how could we not? If our faith only applies to personal decisions, but not to systems and powers that affect millions of lives, then it's not faith. It's just personal preference. The same Jesus who called individuals to repentance also overturned tables in the temple and rebuked leaders for neglecting justice. The same gospel that promises salvation also demands that we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. This is not simply about political opinion. This is about ethical clarity. And in a world increasingly caught in moral ambiguity, someone must be willing to say, this is not right. Let's be honest, faithful people have often been slow to speak when it comes to foreign affairs. We've acted as if those discussions belonged only to politicians and generals. But if we believe God reigns over the nations, then we don't get to stay silent. We pray not because it's a gesture, but because we believe that the heart of kings and presidents and prime ministers is in God's hands. We speak up not to be political, but to be prophetic, to counsel caution when alliances look enticing but lead to darkness. And we lean into discernment, asking not just what works, but what honors God, and so the call is clear. We must be people who do not confuse pragmatism for peace. We must insist on foreign policies that reflect conviction, even when they require courage. We must challenge the idea that helping any regime grow stronger, even one with a track record of enabling terror or silencing minorities, is somehow justified if wrapped in enough strategic language. And we must call our leaders to remember that rearming a nation is never neutral. It is not merely a transaction. It is a testimony, a declaration about who we trust and what we value. In the end, every nation leaves behind more than treaties and trade routes. It leaves behind a legacy of what it chose to stand for when the choices weren't easy, and that legacy is being written now.